My name is Emma Carter. I am 28 years old. Until 3 weeks ago, I truly believed that no matter how much the world changes, one thing always remains safe: family. But I was wrong. The morning my grandmother, Lauren Carter, left this world, the sky was strangely quiet. It felt as if nature had no idea that the biggest emptiness in my life had just been created. Inside the Rismont Community Church, a faint scent of lilies filled the air. At the front stood a mahogany wooden casket, decorated with a wreath of white flowers. I was sitting in the first row. My fingers were clenched together so tightly that my nails were pressing into my palms. For the past 3 years, I had spent almost every night at my grandmother's house. When her health started getting worse, I took a break from nursing school. Many friends told me that I was ruining my life. But I never regretted it. Giving her medicines at 2 in the morning, making oatmeal for her at 6 in the morning, and sometimes just sitting beside her while listening to her old stories. None of that ever felt like a burden to me. She was my family. But the other people sitting inside that church probably didn't know that story. My father was standing at the back, shaking hands with people as if he were attending a business meeting. His suit was perfectly pressed. My mother wiped her eyes with a handkerchief every few minutes. Yet the makeup around her eyes was completely untouched. And my older sister, Vanessa. She stood near the door typing something on her phone. Every now and then she lifted the camera and took pictures of the room. Sometimes it felt like she saw this entire day as some kind of social media post. After the final prayer ended, people slowly began leaving the church. A neighbor held my hand and said softly, "Your grandmother was very lucky to have you with her during her final years." I gave a small smile. Because in that room, only 2 people truly knew that truth: me and my grandmother. Outside in the church parking lot, the air was cold. I was standing near my car when my father walked up behind me. He slipped his hands into his pockets and said calmly, "We cleaned out your grandmother's house last night." I turned toward him. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "We just took out the important things. Meet us at the lawyer's office tomorrow morning. Then you'll find out who your grandmother left her property to." There was a strange certainty in his voice, as if he already knew what was going to happen. I didn't say anything, but that night, as I tried to sleep, one question kept circling in my mind. Would everything really be the way Grandma always said it would be? Or was my entire life about to change the next morning? The next morning, after barely sleeping all night, I arrived at the lawyer's office. The small office on Rismont's Main Street looked completely ordinary from the outside. Red brick walls, a glass door, and a brass plate above it that read, "Harrove and Associates." When I walked in, I saw that my parents were already there. My father sat in the chair directly in front of the desk, as if he were about to lead a meeting. My mother sat beside him, holding her purse tightly with both hands. And my sister Vanessa. She was half reclined in her chair, scrolling through her phone as if this entire situation were nothing more than a small formality. I sat in the chair closest to the door. The room smelled faintly of paper and old wood. A few seconds later, the lawyer, Mr. Harrove, walked in carrying a file. He adjusted his glasses and said without much expression, "Since everyone is here, we'll begin." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. He opened the file and started reading. The final will regarding the estate of the late Lauren Carter. I held my breath. The total savings in bank accounts, $480,000, go to Greg and Diane Carter. My father leaned back slightly in his chair and exhaled quietly. It felt like someone had placed a weight on my chest. The lawyer continued. The rental property on Oak Street, valued at approximately $310,000, goes to Greg and Diane Carter. His voice started sounding distant in my ears. That was the house Grandma always said would help me someday. The lawyer kept reading. Retirement funds, $410,000, go to Greg and Diane Carter. My hands began to shake. The only sound in the room was the turning of paper. Then the lawyer read the next line. For my granddaughter, Emma Carter. My heart suddenly started beating faster. Maybe Grandma really had thought about me. But the next words changed everything. The residential property located on Maple Lane, current estimated value $35,000, goes to Emma Carter. The air in the room seemed to freeze. The Maple Lane house. That old, broken house, whose roof leaned to one side and whose windows had been shattered for years. A quiet whisper escaped my mouth. "This can't be right." Without even looking at me, my father said, "It's completely correct, Emma. The will says it clearly." My sister suddenly suppressed a small laugh. Then she lifted her phone and turned it toward me. "At least you got a house." I looked at the papers on the lawyer's desk. Grandma's name was written there. But the moment I saw the signature, something inside me felt wrong. It looked like Grandma's handwriting. But not entirely. The lines were shaky, as if someone had held her hand and forced the signature. I lifted my head and looked at the lawyer. But by then, he had already closed the file. And the faint satisfaction on my parents' faces did not look normal at all. At that moment, for the first time, I realized this was not just a will. Something in this story was hidden. And perhaps something was hidden in that old house too. After leaving the lawyer's office, I got straight into my car. For a few minutes, I just sat there holding the steering wheel. The engine was off, but my mind was racing. Grandma had always said that one day I would be safe. She had told me many times, "Don't worry, Emma. I've taken care of everything." But what had just happened didn't look anything like that promise. I slowly started the car and drove toward the other side of town, Maple Lane. As I reached the older part of Rismont, the streets began to narrow. Old trees lined both sides of the road, their branches bending over the street. A few minutes later, the house appeared in front of me. Grandma's house. Or maybe now it was mine. As I pulled the car to the side of the road, I looked at it carefully for the first time. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. The wooden railing of the porch was broken in several places. And the front door. The paint on it had almost completely peeled off. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled the key from my pocket. When I opened the door, a cold, stale gust of air rushed out. Inside, there was a faint smell of dampness. I walked in slowly. The living room looked just as I remembered, and yet different. White sheets covered the furniture. The curtains on the windows were filled with dust. An old photo of Grandma and Grandpa still hung on the wall. I stood there for a few seconds. This was the house where I had spent my childhood summers. This was the place where Grandma had taught me how to bake cookies. But today, the house felt empty. Too empty. I slowly walked toward the kitchen. The metal kettle near the sink was still there. Above the counter was the old wooden cabinet where Grandma used to keep her cookbooks. Hoping to find something familiar, I opened the cabinet. On the top shelf sat the same old cookbook, stained with grease. A rubber band was wrapped around it. I picked it up and placed it on the table. As soon as I removed the rubber band, the book opened by itself from the middle. Inside were several old recipe notes in Grandma's handwriting: cornbread, peach cobbler, lemon bars. But suddenly my eyes stopped on a small card. It was tucked between two pages. I picked it up. In Grandma's neat handwriting, there were only 4 words written on it. "Maple Lane is yours." I frowned. That was already written in the will. Then why had she written it separately? I turned the card over. There was another line on the back. Short, but strange. "Look carefully." For a few seconds, I just stared at the card. Then suddenly I realized something. Grandma never wrote puzzle-like messages without a reason. If she had said, "Look carefully," then maybe there was something in this house that I hadn't seen yet. I stared at the small card for a while. Look carefully. Grandma's handwriting always looked calm and clear to me. But this time those 4 words felt like they carried a hidden meaning. I looked around the kitchen. The old wooden table. The cabinet above the sink. The soft sunlight coming through the window. Everything looked completely normal. If something was hidden here, it wouldn't reveal itself easily. I closed the cookbook again and gently placed it back on the counter. Then I started walking through the rest of the house. The first room was the living room. The wooden floor creaked softly with every step. Old photo frames hung on the walls, pictures of Grandma smiling, photos from my childhood, and an old wedding photo of her and Grandpa. For a moment, I touched that photo. "What did you hide, Grandma?" I whispered softly. There was no answer. I walked toward the staircase. Upstairs was the room where Grandma had spent her last healthy days. As soon as I opened the door, a faint smell of dampness filled the air. Dark stains covered parts of the wall, probably from moisture. One corner of the ceiling sagged slightly. This was the same house my parents had called worthless. I slowly stepped into the middle of the room. And then suddenly, I heard the sound of someone knocking on the door downstairs. I froze. A few seconds later, the sound came again. Knock, knock. I quickly walked downstairs and opened the front door. Outside stood an elderly man. White hair, a brown jacket, and a small casserole dish in his hands. He smiled. "You must be Emma." I nodded. "Yes, and you are?" "My name is Mr. Carter. I live in the house across the street. I knew your grandmother for 20 years. He held the casserole out to me. "I thought you might need something to eat." I thanked him and invited him inside. He walked into the kitchen and sat down on a chair. After a few seconds, he said quietly, "Your grandmother once told me something." I immediately turned toward him. "What?" He leaned forward slightly and spoke in a low voice. "She said, if you ever came to live in this house, you should call a certain man." "Who?" He pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket. A phone number was written on it. "Frank Beckett," he said. "An old contractor. Your grandmother trusted him a lot." I took the paper. My heartbeat suddenly sped up. "Did she say why?" Mr. Carter shook his head. "No. But she said, if Emma ever comes to this house, she must call Frank." For a few seconds, the room fell silent. Then I tightened my grip around the paper. Suddenly I remembered the line from Grandma's card. "Look carefully." Maybe this was exactly what she meant. And if there really was a secret hidden inside this house, then perhaps Frank Beckett could help me find it. The next morning, I called Frank Beckett. The phone rang only twice before a deep, calm voice answered. "Frank speaking." I told him my name and that I was Lauren Carter's granddaughter. For a few seconds, the line went completely silent. Then he said slowly, "Lauren, your grandmother?" "Yes." I heard a deep breath on the other side. "She was a very good woman," he said. "Every Christmas she used to bring a pie to my workshop." There was genuine respect in his voice. "What happened to the house?" he asked. I told him about the roof, the plumbing, and the moisture problems. After a moment he said, "I'll be there in an hour." Around 10:30, an old pickup truck pulled up in front of my house. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the truck. White hair, a worn work jacket, and a faded cap on his head. He smiled and extended his hand. "Frank." I shook it. "Emma." Frank stepped inside the house and began looking around the way a doctor examines a patient. He looked at the roof first, then the windows, then the kitchen plumbing. Sometimes he pressed the walls with his hand. Sometimes he tapped the wood lightly with his fingers to hear the sound. After a few minutes, he nodded. "The roof will need to be replaced. The plumbing is old too. But..." He paused and looked around again. "The bones of the house are strong." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means the house isn't as bad as it looks." He wrote something in his notebook. Then we went upstairs, to the same room where Grandma had spent her last healthy days. Frank stood in the middle of the room, studying the walls. Suddenly he stopped near the back wall. He tapped the wall lightly with his fingers. "Knock, knock." Then a little to the left. "Knock, knock." The sound was different. Frank frowned. He tapped the same spot again. This time the sound was clearly different. More hollow. He leaned his head closer to the wall and examined it carefully. "What is it?" I asked. Before answering, he pulled out his tape measure. He measured the width of the wall, then the distance from the door frame. Then once again. For a few seconds, He stayed silent. Then he said slowly, "This is strange." My heart began beating faster. "What?" He placed his hand on the wall. "This wall is thicker than it should be." I tried to understand. "So?" He looked at me. "That means there might be another layer behind it." The room suddenly fell silent. I remembered Grandma's card. "Look carefully." Frank tapped the wall again. This time he spoke very quietly. "I think something has been hidden behind this wall." A chill ran through my body. What could be hidden? Frank looked at me. There was the same curiosity in his eyes that I was sure was in mine. He opened his tool bag. Then he said, "There's only one way to find out." Frank placed his tool bag on the floor and pulled out a small pry bar. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I stood near the door while Frank bent down in front of the wall where he had heard the strange sound. He examined the edge of the wall carefully. Then he ran his fingers along the paint, feeling for a line underneath. After a few seconds, he said softly, "Here, look." I walked closer. At first, I couldn't see anything. But when he pointed to a thin line with his finger, I realized that one part of the wall looked slightly different from the rest. As if a panel had once been placed there. "Someone sealed this very carefully," Frank said. "Did Grandma do it?" Frank shrugged. "There's only one way to find out." He carefully slid the pry bar into the thin line. Then he slowly applied pressure. Creak. A faint sound of wood echoed. My breath stopped on its own. A few seconds later, that section of the wall slowly loosened outward. Frank grabbed the panel with both hands and gently pulled it away. Behind it was darkness. A small empty space. About 2 feet deep. The inside of the space was covered with a plastic sheet. And right in the middle, something was sitting there. A heavy grey metal box. I said quietly, "What is that?" Frank stared at it for a few seconds. Then he pulled the box out and placed it on the floor. A thin layer of dust covered its surface. A small lock was attached to it, but it wasn't locked. My hands were trembling slightly. "Should we open it?" Frank asked. I nodded. He lifted the clip on the box. Click. The lid slowly opened. On top were several papers. Thick documents, like legal files. Frank picked up the first page. His expression suddenly changed. "Emma." "What?" He turned the paper toward me. I started reading. At the top, in large letters, it said, "Last Will and Testament." I stared at the line for a few seconds. "But, we already read the will yesterday," I said. Frank nodded. "Yes." Then he pointed further down. "But this is another one." My eyes moved lower. Grandma's name was written there. Lauren Carter. And this time the signature was perfectly clear and strong. Not shaky. Exactly the way she always wrote. My breath caught. I began reading quickly. In this will. The bank accounts. The rental house on Oak Street. The retirement fund. Everything was in my name. My hands began shaking. "How is this possible?" Frank said quietly, "If this is the real will." He paused and looked at me. "Then the will your parents had read yesterday." He didn't finish the sentence. But I already understood. That will was probably not real. And if that was true, then the box hidden behind the wall of this house was not just hiding a secret. It could change everything. I was still staring at the box on the floor. In my hands was the new will, the one that clearly stated that all of Grandma's property belonged to me. But the box didn't contain just that document. Underneath it, there was something else. A thick blue notebook. The cover was slightly worn, but the moment I saw it, I recognized it. It was Grandma's diary. I slowly picked it up. I opened the first page. A date was written at the top. January 15th. Below it, in Grandma's neat handwriting, were the words, "Today Diane came. She brought some papers with her. She said they were for my bank so that the cost of my medicines could be paid more easily. My eyes can no longer read small letters clearly. She said just sign here, Mom." My breathing slowed. I read the next line. I signed, but I don't know what I signed. The room suddenly felt colder. Frank was reading over my shoulder. I quickly turned the next page. A new date. March 9th. Today Greg came. He said Emma is using my money. He said he saw Emma buying clothes with my debit card. That is not true. Emma has been buying my medicines with her own money. Something tightened in my throat. I turned the page again. June 20th. Today $12,000 were withdrawn from my account. Diane said it was for the taxes on the Oak Street house. But the taxes on that house are never more than $3,000. My fingers tightened around the diary pages. Every page had dates, amounts written down, and small notes beneath them, as if Grandma was slowly beginning to understand everything, but couldn't speak about it. Then I reached the final section. This entry looked slightly different. The handwriting was weaker. Maybe it had been written in the last months of her life. I began reading. Today Ruth took me to her house. We sat at her dining table. Pastor Mitch from the church was there too. I signed my real will, the one I wrote myself. My heart started beating faster. Below that, it said, I left one copy with Ruth. The original will I am hiding in a place where only Emma will find it. My eyes filled with tears. Grandma had known. She had known everything. She had realized what my parents were doing. And that was why she hid the truth behind the wall of this house. Frank said quietly, Emma, this isn't just a family disagreement. I looked up. He pointed at the diary. All of this is evidence. He took a deep breath. This is financial fraud against an elderly person. Suddenly, I felt a strange strength rising in my chest. Grief, anger, and truth. I closed the diary. Now I understood. My parents hadn't just taken Grandma's property. They had taken advantage of her trust. But now, the truth was in my hands. And this time, this story was not going to end the way they wanted. That night, I sat in the living room of Grandma's house. 3 things were placed on the table in front of me. The blue diary, the real will, and the small card that said, Look carefully. I looked out the window. Maple Lane was quiet. The air was cold, and the yellow glow of a distant streetlight fell between the trees. 3 weeks ago, I thought my life was simply moving forward slowly. But now, everything had changed. Frank walked in from the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to me. Have you thought about what you're going to do now? I didn't answer immediately. My mind was full of thoughts. Police, lawyers, court. But suddenly I remembered something else. The event scheduled for Saturday. My parents were hosting a memorial brunch in Grandma's honor. The whole town would be there. I said quietly, Saturday. Frank raised his eyebrows. What? The memorial brunch at the church on Saturday. I looked down at the diary. There. Frank watched me for a moment. Then he said slowly, You're going to tell everyone. I nodded. Yes. My voice was calmer now. Grandma's story will tell itself. The next day, I went to the town's legal aid office. There I met a lawyer, Denise Harlow. I showed her the diary, the real will, and the other documents from the box. She read everything carefully. After about half an hour, she removed her glasses. If all of this is real, she said, then your parents have committed a serious crime. I asked quietly, Can we prove it? She pointed to the diary. This is very strong evidence. Then she added, And if that woman, Ruth, is really a witness, the case becomes even stronger. That evening, I called Ruth. As soon as she answered, a weak but warm voice came through the phone. Hello. Ruth, this is Emma. There was silence for a few seconds. Then she said softly, Emma, your grandmother used to talk about you often. I took a deep breath. I need to ask you something. I told her everything. The wall, the box, the diary, and the real will. For a few moments, there was complete silence on the other side of the phone. Then Ruth spoke. I saw her sign that will. My heart began pounding. "Will you testify?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." I ended the call. Now everything was ready. On Saturday, the entire town would be at the church. My parents believed that day would bring them sympathy and respect. But they didn't know yet that on that same day, Grandma's real story would be revealed. And this time, the truth would not stay hidden. On Saturday morning, the church fellowship hall was full of activity. Long tables covered with white tablecloths had been arranged across the room. Near the windows were flower arrangements, white lilies and baby's breath, exactly the way Grandma liked them. A large screen displayed a slideshow. Old photographs of Grandma. Sometimes she was laughing, sometimes working in her garden, sometimes standing with the family. But I noticed one thing immediately. I was barely in those pictures. Most of the photos showed my parents and my sister. I stood at the back of the hall. In my hands was Grandma's blue diary. Frank stood to my right. And in the second row in front of me, Ruth was seated. A few minutes later, my father walked up to the microphone. His voice, as always, sounded confident. "Today we have all gathered here to remember my mother, Lauren Carter." My mother sat in the front row, slowly dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. My sister operated the slideshow from a laptop. Everything looked perfect, as if someone had written a beautiful story. But no one knew the truth behind that story. My father finished his speech and said, "If anyone would like to share a memory of Lauren, please come forward." For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, I stood up. A ripple moved through the room. People turned to look at me. I walked slowly to the front and stood at the microphone. My father's face immediately hardened. "Emma," he said quietly, "this is not the right time." I looked at him calmly. "This is exactly the right time." Silence spread across the room. I took the microphone. "All of you knew my grandmother as a kind and gentle woman." I paused briefly. But the last years of her life were not as peaceful as you might think. People began glancing at each other. My mother sat up straight in her chair. I opened the diary. "This is my grandmother's diary." I began reading the first entry. January 15. "Today Diane came with some papers. She said just sign here, Mom." Soft whispers started spreading through the room. I read the next entry. March 9. "Greg said Emma is taking my money. That is not true." My father's face turned pale. My mother stood up. "Stop this, Emma," she said. "You don't understand." Then a voice came from the second row. "No." Ruth had stood up. "Looking at everyone," she said. Lauren was fully aware when she signed her real will. The entire hall was completely silent now. At that moment, the sound of a car door closing came from outside the church. A few seconds later, two people walked through the hall doors. A woman and a man. Both wearing badges. One of them said, "Greg and Diane Carter." My father slowly turned toward them. The female officer spoke calmly. "We need to ask you a few questions regarding your mother's estate." Every person in the room was now looking at them. And for the first time, the confidence had disappeared from my parents' faces. This time, the truth was standing right in front of them. The church was still silent. Everyone's eyes were fixed on my parents and the two officers. My father stood there for a few seconds, as if he didn't know what to say. Then he gave a small laugh. "This is some kind of misunderstanding." But his voice was no longer as strong as before. The female officer replied calmly, "Sir, we need to review some matters regarding your mother's bank records and will." Fear was clearly visible in my mother's eyes. My sister stepped back and stood beside a chair. I stood there watching everything. Strangely, I didn't feel anger in that moment. There was only a strange calmness. As if a truth that had been buried for a long time had finally surfaced. A few minutes later, the officers escorted my parents outside the church. As soon as the door closed, whispers slowly began spreading across the room. People began talking to each other. Some came and stood beside me. Mr. Carter held my hand. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," he said. Frank nodded with a faint smile. Ruth walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. She planned everything carefully, she said softly. I looked out the window. A police car was parked outside the church. My parents stood a short distance away, speaking with the officers. For the first time, I realized this story wasn't just about my family. It was a story about truth and lies. And the truth was finally winning. Over the next few weeks, everything changed quickly. An investigation began. Bank records were uncovered. The diary and the real will were presented in court. Eventually, the court delivered its verdict. The will that my parents had presented was declared invalid. Grandma's real will was recognized as the legitimate one. And according to it, all of Grandma's property was transferred to me. But strangely, that day I felt happier about something else more than the money. I was sitting on the porch of the old house on Maple Lane. The roof had been repaired. New glass had been installed in the windows. In the yard, Grandma's old roses had begun blooming again. Frank had finished repairing the house. And every Sunday, Ruth came over for tea. Sometimes I think, if my parents had never done what they did, I might never have discovered what Grandma had truly left for me. She didn't just give me a house. She gave me a beginning. And that day I understood something. Sometimes the thing people think is your defeat becomes your greatest victory. That house on Maple Lane, which my parents thought would be my punishment, had become the beginning of my new life. And maybe that's why even today, when I sit on that porch and feel the evening breeze, I remember something Grandma used to say. She always said, "The truth can be hidden, but not forever." If you have ever faced someone in your life who betrayed your trust, or if you feel that someone around you is being treated unfairly, tell me in the comments. I would truly like to know. What would you have done if you were in my place? And if you found this story interesting, and you want to hear more stories filled with truth like this, make sure to like the video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because I will be sharing many more stories where the truth eventually comes to light. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next story.